Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nerd Alert.
What's going on, everyone?
This is the show where we talk about nerd culture. Sorry, I think I
Nerd Alert.
We talk about the things that make us who we are today, the things that we identify with, sometimes even the things that we make fun of about ourselves. Nerd culture has evolved a lot since the early days of nerds like the Nutty Professor to now, but we're going to go through all of that. First, I got to introduce my partner in crime on this, Matt, Mr. Thanatos Comics.
Thank you for having me. John's with Comics. John's Comics and with. I am glad to be here to talk some nerd.
Right? And we both have some similarities in our background. I like seeing the Tolkien there next to you. You went even like deep Tolkien. Is this, I can't even pronounce it. The Silmarillion?
Silmarillion?
Well, that one right there.
Like, I don't have any nice copies of Lord of the Rings, so I figure like that. So you have that.
This beast here, yeah. And then I've got my Lord of the Rings characters here. But we'll get into all that. I want to thank some people who showed up right off the bat in the chat. Let's see. Thanatos is the first one in the room.
I'm here to support you.
Whoopty Bird, Comics Misexplained. The Slab Dragon is, of course, here. Thank you, TJ. Kachung, Wingnut, Boy Who Had Seven. We got both Matts now. DK Comics and Cosplay. Thank you, Delphia, for showing up. Flaming Sheila's here. Or is it Flaming? I'm assuming it's Flaming. JP's Budget Collecting, Perry Comics. Uh-oh, White Whale's here. Look out. Wonder Woman, I should say, is here. And Stonecutter Cam and Comic Books NYC. Kavi, it's good to see you, brother. So,
people in the chat.
Yeah, so we got some great folks here. Thank you for coming. Hit the like button for us. But we are here to talk about nerds. Early on, Matt and I were trying to find a show to do together, and we bandied around a lot of ideas, but we kept coming back to this problem of we wanted to talk about everything. Like, we have a love for Harry Potter. We have a love for a lot of different books and movies. And obviously comic books. There were so many things we wanted to talk about. And what it kept coming into my mind was we're talking about this culture of nerds. And we wanted to find a way to get into that culture on a sort of deeper level. The problem was the term nerd is used in a variety of ways. It is not consistently utilized. And certainly over time, it's changed a lot.
Absolutely. And a thing that I am looking forward to is we've each been exposed through our childhood, through our adolescence, through adulthood. We've been exposed to different things. And for example, for me, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons. I almost know nothing about it, despite I've played like Munchkin. So there's a lot of things that I am excited to learn about, as well as discuss like things that I know that you might not, and bouncing off the chat to see like what they nerd out about. Like, everyone's got their little, we all share comics, but when it comes to outside of comics, everybody's going to be a little different. And I think it's going to be a great way to have a discussion and get everyone in the chat involved as well.
It's funny you mentioned D&D. Obviously, I'm a fan. I've got some of my second edition books here behind me, and I saw that Kachung says he has 12 second edition D&D hardcover books. Okay, I don't know. Two, I could understand maybe 2. 12, he's pushing that to a whole new level there, and I respect it. The other thing is, we don't come here as with armor on. We are willing to be made fun of, and we are certainly willing to throw it back out, because the whole point of being a nerd is you're going to take fire, right? You're going to take some fire on these things, and that's part of the fun of being a nerd. Is as you get older, I feel like I've learned to it's so much better just to own it and just that's me, than it is to just sort of let people make fun of you and just take it,
Unless you're a LARPer. And then you are a whole nother level of nerd.
There are so many pieces of this pie, right? So we talked a lot about pop culture too. The nerds from, like I was saying, Nutty Professor, the original Nutty Professor with Lewis, all the way through to, we were talking about the Big Bang Theory. The vision of what a nerd is has evolved a lot. And certainly I think nowadays it's a lot cooler to be a nerd. It's almost become an acceptable thing. But you look at things like the Revenge of the Nerds or characters on television like Steve Urkel. There's a vision for what a nerd is, with the pocket protectors and unable to go on dates and get women, and just sort of being able to be social outcasts and have that be an acceptable humor. Obviously, Anthony Michael Hall made a living doing this. That was kind of his character in most movies.
Yeah.
And how have you viewed the term nerd, Matt, in your life?
So for me, when I think of nerd, there's definitely like the Steve Urkel and the Screech. Growing up, Freaks and Geeks was really big. Well, not really big, I guess, but it's kind of gotten this like cult following. But I've always been like in a weird position. In my high school and middle school, it was very diverse. Like I never had a specific group of friends that was like I played a lot of sports. I also did theater. I was in the IT club. I was the president of the book club. So like I had all these different views of people, and I got to see how people were in each of these environments. And so when I think of nerds, I don't know, it definitely has evolved from you know what, actually, this is kind of off topic. Did you ever watch the movie 21 Jump Street, the new one?
Oh yeah.
When what's his name goes back to school and he thinks that he's going to be the cool one, but it's
right.
it's the other kid that was the cool guy because he was the nerd. And that was like, holy crap, that's real. Like this is kind of how the like nerd has changed, where it's no
that's a great example. It's not off topic at all, because that is definitely what we're talking about. That idea that there was a shift where being Anthony Michael Hall when you were in the 80s or 90s was a bad thing. Being Anthony Michael Hall in the 2000s is like a good thing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, but you always, growing up and I never used the word nerd in a derogatory fashion. I always think it was, for me, it was always fun. Like I always enjoyed it. But definitely I just told you today that I finally read the textbook definition. Like the Webster's definition of nerd is awful. It is so, like, it hurts. Like, dang, that's what I've been calling people, but I've never meant it in that fashion. So I'm happy that it's changed, and I'm happy that it's more in the spotlight, and it's okay to be smart. It's okay to study hard. It's okay to read. It's okay to play with, I mean, maybe not playing with action figures when you're a 30, 40-year-old man. Look at you nerd. Look at those toys back there.
I'm saying, like, if you look at a movie like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, that is a classic modern nerd where we're rooting for this character and we like this character. He collects action figures. He plays video games all day long, but he's also, you said you looked up the term nerd. Obviously, there's an element of intelligence, social awkwardness, and unpopularity that sort of goes along with the vision or understanding of what a nerd is. And I certainly had a lot of those elements as well. I don't know that I could call myself intelligent. I was definitely on the low end of that, but I hung out with really smart people and they allowed me to hang out with them. I saw some people mention that they were the oxymoron, I think is what Kachung said. He was a nerd who was good at sports. But I think that, like, the truth is nerd culture is usually far more diverse than it gets credit for. And you talked about being members of tech clubs and sports groups. And I did sports in high school, but I was not a big jock. I did theater, but I was not a huge theater guy. I did writing groups and journalism clubs and things like that. But I was never just one of those things. And I think it's easy to slap that label on people. And I think that's the hurtful side of nerd, is people slap that label on to people and say, this is what you are. This is all you are. I'm putting you in this box. And I think the reality is nerd as a term has come to evolve to a place where it is very inclusive. And I made the joke before we went live about fantasy football and the idea that it's ultimately Dungeons and Dragons for jocks, for people that love sports. And my brothers are incredibly into that. And I can make fun of them for that and say that how ridiculous that it is that they spend their whole weekend obsessing over the stats and how it affects their fantasy team. The same way that they can make fun of me when I want to play D&D and I'm telling them that my 5th level wizard would have dominated, but somehow rolled a snake eyes and I copped out.
Well, I mean, nerd. So I brought up the text, but like, if you don't know, if you just Google nerd definition, it comes up with a foolish or contemptible person who lacks social skills or is boringly studious. Boringly studious.
Yeah. And there was a comment in the chat about geek versus nerd and how some people say like, I'm a geek because nerds make more money. This idea that like you could be there are layers to the nerd cake. And there are several different slices to it. Obviously, my DVD collection, people come into my house and they look at me as like, okay, he's the movie nerd, right? If my comic books are out, I can get labeled the comic book nerd. When I'm with my D&D friends, you can be the D&D nerd. And there are all these different layers to my interests, but most of them are not what I would consider to be socially acceptable in a broader sense, or at least they are not socially popular.
Yeah. So I was going to would now be a good time to tell you my story.
I do want to hear this. Yes.
So, okay. So my mom, like, you guys know that I started reading Green Lantern kind of in that, like, in high school. And on one of my trips to a comic book shop, my mom and I had to walk through this room to get to where the comics were. And in this room, there was always a table, and we never saw anyone at this table. Big table, big square table. I think they played Warhammer and some other stuff on it. But this one specific time, there were like 4 or 5 guys, maybe girls, I don't know, sitting around this table, and like 2 of them were wearing like dark cloaks. And you know, like I walked through pretty quick, but like I walked in and I ignored them, didn't think anything of it, walked towards the comic book shop, and my mom stops. And my mom is like a 5 foot tall little Japanese lady, super adorable. She's usually not, she just stops. And I will never forget how she said it's like, this is the first time I've ever heard this term in a derogatory fashion. She just looked at these people and said, "Nerds."
Oh, wow.
And then just kept walking into the comic book room. And I'm like, oh, that was embarrassing. Like, she didn't mean it, but she kind of meant it. I felt pretty bad, but at the same, like, I thought it was so funny that my little Asian mom said that to these people. And so I don't know, I guess to me, like, D&D has been the pinnacle, you know, like if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, like you have to nerd.
Throughout LARPing, I think LARPing is almost the like tip of the spear, right? If we're the arrowhead, if D&D is the arrowhead, then LARPing is the tip of the spear there. But yeah, I mean, there's also this element of like, you're talking about how your mom might have made a comment, but like I grew up with 2 brothers, an older and a younger. I was getting it from both sides. They were very athletic. Sports was their big outlet, and they were incredibly good at it. And I was just not, that was just not me. And I sort of even tried to go the other way. I wanted to define myself in a very different way. And I was lucky to have a mom who really supported that. And she even let me have like Dungeons and Dragons birthday parties where I would have, my mom would put together these calligraphied invitations with like wax stamps that would send to my friends that had the description of who their character was when they arrived at the house, and they could dress up. They'd come over and we would play like all day games. And my stepdad would actually run the games for us, and we would be in costumes. It was nuts. They really supported it. Same with the comics. My mom let me buy comics whenever we visited my grandmother. We were given pocket money to go to the Circle K, and we could walk out of their little like gated pine. It was in Pine Top, Arizona, which is like basically like up in the mountains, beautiful pines and snow in the winter. And we could walk out of their little gated community because they had to gate it for the bears. We could walk out to the Circle K and get a comic book every time we wanted to go. And they had the spinner rack and everything. So for me, comics was a big part of that for sure. My mom was dope. I agree, Boy Who Had 7. But it was also a part of like my parents were divorced at that point. So I think my mom was trying to connect to me on some level, knowing that I was this like black sheep among her three boys. My dad was fine with the other two because he could watch a football or basketball game with them. But for me, he was like, I don't know what to do with this thing. It's like somebody handed him I don't know, just an alien, and he didn't know what to do with it.
That's too funny.
But he's gotten way cooler about it. I really don't want to deride him at all because he's the guy that helped me get all these books this Christmas. He supported like me spending this insane amount of money at Christmas time to buy all these amazing books. He's really led the charge for me to go to film school and been super okay with that side of my nerd geekdom or whatever, or the performing arts side, supported me in all my plays. But I had those other elements as well. Like, you know, I think everybody has those people that support you are like some people mentioning their spouses. I married a woman who loves geek culture in a big way. I read the entire Lord of the Rings to her, like the whole trilogy out loud with voices and everything. Like, and all the Harry Potter books as well, I should say. And some of we talked about Sword of Truth. I read some of those as well. And she loved it. On our honeymoon, I read all of Two Towers and we almost finished Return of the King. It was like a big, like at night we'd lay in bed and we were reading Lord of the Rings. Like I still geek out on that regularly, that she was that cool about it.
That's always pretty nice. I didn't have that in my relationship. It was,
but you do now. Like Melody seems like she's really supportive of that.
Melody is very supportive. For me growing up, I didn't have like hearing you talk about your family and how kind of like everybody's kind of come together to support you, and like your mom like that. My mom was almost the exact opposite until I was kind of in that high school range. When my dad was around when I was younger, he used to like buy me whatever I wanted. So I collected Magic cards, Pokemon cards, and my mom ended up burning them all and said that my Magic cards were the devil.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that kind of went out the window. But for me, it was always like what started my path to really embracing my nerd, I think, was books. And something that you talking about reading Lord of the Rings to your family. One of the very few memories I have of my dad is when I was little, and I definitely don't remember any of this other than the fact that he did it, was he read The Hobbit to us, me and my sister. He had this like old rickety like recliner chair, you know, the one that kind of bounces. I don't know.
Yeah. It's got like a swing. It's like a swing back or whatever.
We would sit in front of it and he would read The Hobbit to us.
That's cool.
And, I think that always stuck with me. So with my own kids, when Adiana was little and stuff, I definitely tried to read as much as I could. We read a lot of Harry Potter together. And I think that emphasizing that it's okay to do these kinds of things when they're young is very, very important.
And I'll say as a teacher, like I can see in my classroom, the kids that have been read to regularly and the kids that haven't, like it shows night and day. You can just tell. And the kids that get read to have an interest in stories. They find stories valuable. And it doesn't matter what avenue they go to. Some kids are into, like my wife loves nonfiction. That's her favorite kind of literature. Me as a kid, I wanted only books that had dragons on the cover. That was like all I wanted to read. But everybody finds their niche once they've started down that road of seeing that books have something to offer. And that definitely is true with my girls. They have days when they want to read only about princesses and ponies. And I'm like, that's cool. You guys do you. But I've also read like, you know, The Hobbit with Kate. We've read the Hobbit together, and we're not ready for Lord of the Rings yet, but that's soon enough. We will get there. Kate and I've read all the Harry Potters together. She's obsessed. Charlie and I were now on Harry Potter 2 together. So we're working our way through those. But I think it lays a real foundation for just enjoying stories wherever you find them, in movies, in plays, in books, in comics. You lay a foundation for enjoying story.
Yes. It's entertainment on a completely different level. And I mean, to me, it feels like the whole, when you think about, like I read all these fantasy stories and you know, you always want that sitting at a campfire, you know, someone playing an instrument and singing and storytelling. And just like, to me, reading books and doing all this kind of stuff makes me feel like I'm part of that legacy.
Oh yeah. TJ, I don't know if you saw, TJ says he played live D&D in costumes in the catacombs under the college he attended. And that was once an asylum back in the 1920s. That is killing. Dude, that is phenomenal.
So I have to admit, like I said, D&D has always been the pinnacle for me. Like, if you play D&D, you're a freaking nerd. But
own it.
Despite all of that, I think that my trepidation of like ever doing that is one, because I'm super introverted, right? Everything I've done nerdy wise, other than like this YouTube stuff, has been by myself. I used to walk around campus like this. Like I would have a head in a book. I didn't talk to people. I never shared any of that stuff, and I never met anyone that played D&D. And I think if I had, I probably would have loved it. And even to this day, I think if I ever had the opportunity to at least go and try it out, and I hear it all, like the DM, it really all depends on the kind of DM that you end up with. Could change. It could be a good experience, it could be a bad experience, but I think like I want it to be on my bucket list. I'm gonna add it, because that's something that I want to experience at some point.
I will say, I was in a chat where this came up, and somebody was saying that it would be fun to get like 4 people in a YouTube live stream and play like an hour at a time, with one person DMing and 4 people playing, and just play online. But we'll get to that another time, I think. But for me, it was like, yeah, I found a friend that was really into it. Only one of my friends was into it, but his whole family was into it.
Yeah.
So we would do these games. I did a game with him just a handful of years ago. We got together for it. It's harder now that we all have kids, but we did a whole game with his family and a couple more of his friends. There were like 6 of us playing, and it was like epic. For me, it was always like another way to do story, right? The DM is telling a story, but I get to play a character in that story and control a little bit of where the story goes. It was just another layer of that for me. It was like a little bit of acting and a little bit of a comic book or a fantasy novel all together.
So what was your D&D character? What was your class?
I've played so many different ones. It's hard. My favorites, I always liked a good rogue. Somebody who is like, you just never know if they're going to stab you in the back if they want something. Like, that was the best part about a rogue, is there were no wrong choices, right? As long as you were thinking about yourself before the group, that Han Solo mentality, right? The original Han Solo, not like the Jedi Han Solo. But like where it's like, yeah, I'm here for the money. Like, if you're gonna get between me and my money, you're gonna get backstabbed.
Yeah, I always thought if I ever did play D&D, like I used to have some of my friends in theater and stuff. We'd always have our nerd conversations, or when we'd go see a really nerdy movie, and you're young and you're always like, well, if I could be anything, like what would you be, or what would your superpowers be and stuff. And I think the idea of like a battle mage always enticed me, because I am a bigger guy. Like, I've always been athletic, and like wielding a giant fire axe or something, right? Like a war hammer made out of electricity, something like
Gandalf with that giant sword Glamdring, and he's wailing on somebody.
That'd be way cooler looking than Gandalf.
Well, yeah.
I'd have like fiery pauldrons.
The fact that you use the word pauldrons shows that you belong on this show with me.
I did. So I guess, does World of Warcraft count as?
It's the video game version of D&D, right?
Warcraft was huge, and I remember
I played that for years. I played that for at least 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I lost some girlfriends over World of Warcraft. That was a time suck.
Yeah, my wife put the kibosh on it when I wanted to buy a new upgrade, and it was like, what is the cost of this? Like, where are we going with this? Yeah. So now I want to explain a little bit of the point of this show. Not only do we want to talk about whatever it is that's interesting us, but we also want to put a spotlight on one level of nerd culture, one area of nerd culture that we think is important, or in some way or another relevant to the both of us. We obviously have examples of some elements that have been huge in our lives, but there's many. We made this epic list of topics to really consider. The goal being to sit together with all of you and hear your perspectives on one or another element from nerd culture. Obviously, we've set up YouTube channels and have, in Matt's case, almost 1,000 subscribers that are interested in us talking about this one sliver of the nerd pie. But it's an incredibly diverse pie with so many different layers. And my brothers would argue that certainly their love for movies, their loves for obscure, like quoting Arrested Development, you could argue that these are definitely slivers of that same pie, or The Office, or whatever. Fantasy football being a sliver maybe on the far side from, if you imagine like a color wheel, you got D&D on one side and fantasy football on the opposite.
I mean, maybe NFL players are really just playing a game of war. I mean, they're wearing pads, they're beating each other up.
The birth of sport came out of solving war conflicts, right? You talk about your team versus their team, and the losing team getting slaughtered by their king, right? So
lacrosse used to be, I think, for the Native Americans back in the day, that was an alternative to battling tribes.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be here in a minute, Charlie. Sorry. Charlie's trying to go to sleep, but sister's not back yet. So she's So tonight, our main focus is comic books. Obviously, comic books are an important element of nerd culture. And I have been at parties where I've been talking to a person that I know is interested in comics, but at the same time, been able to see how people responded to our conversation. Now, loving comics when I was in junior high or high school was one layer of nerddom. But obviously now, with the shocking, impressive success of Marvel movies and pop culture, it's almost now cool to collect comics and to talk about comics. So there's been a huge shift in comic book nerddom, even in my lifetime. Like I know when I was a kid, if I talked about comic books at school, I would have people looking at me in a funny way, and girls would probably be running in the opposite direction. But nowadays, I can talk about comic books, and I have people coming over to talk about it.
Could you imagine? So I really think like the Marvel MCU really changed everything. When like having this information in your brain that was so nerdy that you kind of kept it to yourself or kept it to your group of people. And then people went and saw Iron Man. And then people walked out of Iron Man and everyone had questions, right? Everybody was like, who was this guy? What was this? And for the first time, comic book nerds were absolute gods. They had all the answers.
Like an encyclopedia, right?
Like, what do you mean you didn't know who that was? And then you just start spouting out facts. And for me, it was a struggle because I wasn't a Marvel guy. So I was still kind of like, I was the guy asking questions because, I love nerd stuff. But then some of my friends who collected Marvel were like, oh yeah, he was this, and this was accurate to the comic books and this wasn't. And Robert Downey Jr. did a great job. And I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. And it was just like, I can't imagine, a lot like people that were so familiar with all this stuff before the MCU hit and just feeling like empowered that, they were the subject matter experts after every single one of these movies. It had to be so cool.
Well, and then at the same time, when those movies first started, like when not even the MCU, but like even when it was like a little bit earlier, like after the Tim Burton films that were somewhat successful, you had people like Nicolas Cage flying his nerd flag, naming his kid Kal-El, and you'd see pictures of Nicolas Cage in comic book shops buying comics. Or inversely, nowadays, Samuel Jackson is always getting his picture taken in comic book shops, where he's like the coolest guy ever. He's like in a comic book shop buying comics. Like he is legitimately interested in this stuff even before he was Nick Fury. Or I remember so I live in Southern California. The Lakers are very big here. And a buddy of mine, we used to go to this one comic book shop over here in Orange County. And he said he went in one day right after Sin City came out. And he's in there shopping and Kobe Bryant walks in. Like the biggest basketball celebrity at that time ever. He was still playing with Shaq. He walks into the comic book shop. He says, I just saw Sin City. That movie was crazy good. What should I read? And he just started buying comics off the shelf because a movie made it cool for the coolest player in that sport to roll into a comic book shop and just start buying stuff.
It's funny that you mentioned Sin City. The first comic book movie that came out that I had actually read the graphic novel for was 300. Which seems kind of recent, and it's kind of weird because I never read Spider-Man. I never read I watched the X-Men show, but I never read X-Men. until later. But like, I remember being so excited for 300 because I had read the Frank Miller story and I thought it was amazing. And so that was like my first experience going into a theater. Like, I got this. Like, I'm excited to see the comparisons and the differences. Like, it was going to be great.
Oh yeah. And with those, again, I liked Batman. So seeing those early Tim Burton films, I didn't love them, but I was like, wow, I'm getting to see this. I was too young to have seen Superman in the theaters, but I grew up watching that Christopher Reeve film and the subsequent sequels. But for me, the first like comic book film that really made me feel like I was seeing the characters I loved on screen was no doubt the Hugh Jackman X-Men, the first X-Men film. Because I grew up loving Wolverine and the X-Men, and to be able to see like, whoa, somebody finally made a movie out of these characters. I had the animated show, but to be able to see it on a big screen and just be like, yes, this is so cool. And it was, for me, it was the beginning of a lot of that stuff.
Oh man, every time you mention the X-Men show, I have like that theme song goes in my head and I get all pumped up. Like, that is so good. I need to change that.
And I will say, like, several people are talking about like being able to mention that you liked comic books. When did that first officially happen for you? Like, I will say, you can look on my channel back, whatever it was, like 3 months ago, when my family outside of this home found out that I had a YouTube channel about comic books. Like, you see it happen on camera because I had to tell my brothers, because we were all sleeping over at my dad's house in the desert and I was not going to miss Saturday morning comics. So I set up the laptop and I'm doing it. And my brothers are like, you're doing what right now? And my younger brother didn't wake up. So I was fine with that. He sleeps in. So I was like, but my older brother's like walking behind me in the shots. He's like doing funny jokes, but more than anything, I could tell my older brother was jealous and it felt so good. I was like, yeah, this is fun, Bob. You should join me. He wanted to sit down in a chair next to me so bad, but he knew if he did, he would have to relinquish his right to comedy and to make fun of me. So instead, he's like standing on that side of the camera, making jokes and having some playful action. But the truth is, like, nerd culture, I could see that the shift in nerd culture. I had kept it a secret, fearful of like the response, and then I realized like the world has shifted in a big way, you know, and that's the impact it had on me.
Yeah, for me, because I didn't read too many comics, other like Green Lantern was the only comic that I really had the opportunity to read growing up, and for me, like, watching the Superman movies was always fun. Watching all the different Batman movies, you know, as a kid, even like as much as people hated like Batman Forever, like as a kid, I loved it. I thought Robin's outfit was super cool.
Well, and I worked at a movie theater when that came out, so I saw that movie. I mean, was it Kiss from a Rose? Was at the end of that movie? I heard that Seal song so many times in a day.
But for me, I think finding out that a bunch of these movies and shows were originally comics was super cool. I didn't know Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a comic. I didn't know that prior to a Star Wars movie, there was a comic. You know, a month prior to Star Wars coming out, the comic adaptation came out. I mean, Blade. I didn't know. I loved Blade when I was younger.
Somebody else threw out Blade in the chat. I got to go scroll up to find him.
Had no idea that Blade was a comic book. You know, there was just so much that I feel like until I joined the comic book YouTube community, because for me, comic collecting was very singular. Like, I did it for myself. Some of my best friends in high school had no idea until they saw my YouTube channel. Like, you know, we collected comics at the same time. Like, how did we never talk about this? Like, well, it's because I don't know.
JP threw out Blade earlier, and there were several movies that I think people are mentioning as well that kind of allowed for this shift. They're throwing out Goonies. It's a great example of like a lot of nerd kids banding together. E.T. actually has kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in it. Like, the kids at the very beginning, they're all playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're all identifying as nerds, even though the older brother acts like he's cooler than the younger brother, and there's a lot of heckling that goes on. Like, the older brother is clearly not popular at his school. He's just playing nerd games on the weekends with his friends.
And I think that's like the Goonies, like the modern Goonies is obviously Stranger Things. You know, it gives you like
totally.
They're almost like the same, like a huge adventure with danger and, you know, little nerdy kids. And like the older brother, the guy with beautiful hair would be the guy in Stranger Things.
Yeah, totally. And so my question to you, Matt, is as far as your love for comics and having a YouTube channel, are there people in your life, families and friends, that have no clue that you do this, that this is like your passion on the side?
I would probably say there's quite a few. I do have a bunch of my Hawaii friends on Instagram who, you know, like before they follow me, I let them know like, hey, just FYI, like it's not a lot of me on this channel. Like on my Instagram, it's a lot of comic books. Like fair warning. A lot of people in the military knew that I read comics and knew that I was nerdy, but most of the people that I've ever been in the military with were like my gym buddies. You know, like, what are we doing? Let's go to the gym. Let's take pre-workout. Like, not let's go to the comic book shop. However, at my last base, when I was stationed in Nebraska, I met a group of guys that we ended up building a relationship over comic books. One of the guys, actually, we started a fantasy comic book league where it was right when the New 52 started. And we drafted comic book characters. And every single week, so like you tried to build your team so that way you had a character releasing a comic every week during that month. And you would read the comic, and if they beat some cronies, if they defeated the big bad, if there was a first appearance, if there was something going on in that comic, you would get points for that character. And so, like, I think I had Sinestro, I had Larfleeze at the time. I did a bunch of Green Lantern stuff.
This idea is so good. How have we not utilized this yet?
Because it's so hard. It was so time consuming because you had to read every single comic and you were going against someone else. So like if their character died or like something like that, like you would lose points.
Oh man.
If they got defeated, if something, you know, stuff like that. It was so fun. It was just time consuming. And then I PCS'd, and I don't know. I don't think they're still doing it, but we had a whole website dedicated to it.
Wow.
That was like my first experience sharing my comic book collecting with other people.
Because like before I was on YouTube, the only people that knew I liked comics were probably my brothers and my parents. That and my wife. Like it was really just like a small group. And I had not been buying comics over the last year. I've obviously upped that, but there were several years before that where I took time off from buying. So for me, like getting on YouTube was like this big deal where I was like, okay, I had an Instagram, and every once in a while I might post a comic book, but it was not a comic book Instagram. It was for me and my kids. I didn't like Facebook, so I was using Instagram instead. Then it started to be more and more comics, and I was like, you know what? I really need a separate account for comics. So I switched it over to I had one of each. And I can show people how to do this if they're worried about doing it. I thought it would be a huge pain in the butt. It's actually super easy to have 2 Instagram accounts and to flip between them. They've designed it so that it's incredibly functional. But once I did that, my nerd flag just flew. Like I could have a full channel just to comic books. And I had a few family and friends that followed me over and now follow me on both accounts. And every once in a while I bump into them. They're like, wow. I can see the look in their eyes. Like, I didn't realize how much you liked. I knew you liked comic books, but I didn't realize that there was a whole layer to it. And then once the girls started coming on the YouTube channel with me, they started telling their friends at school. So now some of their friends follow us. So I dropped Kate off at a play date today, and I go in, and the dad says, you know, I've been seeing your channel. Like I've been watching. You got like a lot of He was like talking to me about it. I was like, this is so weird. Like now it's like a starting point of conversation for good or bad with people where I usually would keep that stuff totally separate and just talk, you know, dads would always talk to me about sports and I'd be like, oh yeah, that's exciting. Like I love sports ball. And it's like, just have a conversation. But now it's like every once in a while I get a dad who's like, I hear you like comics. Is this book worth anything? And they'll grab a book that they had when they were a kid and they'll be like showing me their books.
And you're like, that's 90s Drek. It's not worth anything.
Nine times out of 10, that's what I'm telling people for sure.
I
did have a dad who just, like at the end of last school year, I was teaching his daughter, and he had another daughter who was in Charlie's class. So we were talking at a play date or something. And he knew that I was doing this channel. He's like, I just bought Amazing Spider-Man #1. Wow. And he's like, I'm sending it off to be slabbed. So we were having a legit conversation at a birthday party about comics and slabbing. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I didn't know there were people that like did this offline outside of comic book shops.
Yeah, it's always weird having conversations at comic book shops now. Like, it's more comfortable talking to people online than it is meeting people at shops. I had something I was going to say, but it's gone.
Now, so for me, I'm still hiding it from certain people. At my job, the only people that know at my work that I like comics this much are the people whose kids are the same age as my girls. So they go to parties and my girls talk about it, but that's about it. Every once in a while, I'll be having a conversation with one of them and a coworker will overhear it. And I'm just like, do I talk quieter? Do I keep this a secret? Because this is, it's still nerd culture is still embarrassing in larger social circles for me. I don't know how it is for you, Matt.
You know where I felt the biggest stress about having a YouTube channel about comic books and Instagram was after my divorce, and I had to start dating. I was like, when I start dating, this is going to get really weird, because having to be like, hey, you want to go out tonight? Like, I have a live show tonight. It's going to be weird. So I remember.
As if you couldn't reschedule a live show to go out on a date. Okay,
so if you go back to one of the, I don't think it's probably not there anymore, but the first time I was ever on the Comic Core, it was the first time that Melody ever saw me on YouTube, and I was so embarrassed. And even before Melody, going on dates and stuff, or like, I have my own apartment and stuff, and I have all these comics on display, and I'm thinking, like, if I bring a girl home, I'm the 40-year-old virgin,
right? Because he has to strip his whole apartment of stuff before the girl comes over.
So that was the first time since doing this whole thing where I was like, oh no, maybe I have to change. Like, I'm still a nerd, and but maybe I have to hide a bit of part of that. But then I kind of accepted it. And I'm like, you know what? Like, I did that with my ex, where she didn't really quite know how nerdy I was until it was too late. So I let off with it, hey, just FYI, I have a YouTube channel, I have an Instagram. They're completely nerdy. I used to be one of my opening lines on dating apps. It was 90% sure I'm way nerdier than you. And then prove it. And I'm like, here's my Instagram. Good luck.
Well, yeah, when it comes to sharing it too, the first few times when I really let friends know, the girls really wanted to have a couple of birthday parties in a row where they were doing superhero themed. And rather than pay for a crud of paper decorations, I brought out my comic books and I put little push pins in the bag and board and hung them in displays all around the living rooms and in the kitchen, so that I took down anything on the wall and just put these up. And it looked really cool, but I had so many parents that were coming through going, wow, that's a lot of comic books. Do you own these? And it was it looked cool for a decoration, but then I left them up for a month because I just wanted to look at. I hadn't looked at my books for so long, but it became a chance to have. And I'll tell you, there were several dads who were like, "Oh, I have that one. Oh, I really wanted to get that one." It was a fun way to have a conversation. Splash Page Comics says, my son's friends subbed me up in high school.
That's fantastic.
And I know that a Boy Who Had 7 does I want to say a Bible study with a whole group of kids, and they all sub his channel as well. And so it's well known within those circles that you have this comic book affinity. But I still do feel like there are, my mom's side of the family has no clue. My dad now knows, and he's a subscriber, and he'll show up in my chats, and my brothers make fun of me. And that's something that I feel like you should armor yourself with and not just, be able to stand up for it a little bit. I don't go into conversations with my brothers to talk about it, but they're going to bring it up. I know they will. and I can throw fantasy football right back at them. So we have this back and forth. But you armor yourself with it. And I have some of my family that knows all about my interest in comics and some that have no clue. Because there's definitely groups that I don't talk about it with.
Which is understandable. I mean, you definitely want to accept it as much as you can and want to. But I mean, professionally, sometimes it has, or like in your case, you know, people just probably aren't going to be interested in it. You don't want to bore them to death, which is kind of what I do with Melody. Like, I know she accepts my nerdiness and she's also very nerdy. But I don't want that to be like the only thing I talk about with her. So I do try to like separate that a little bit. Like I try to, hey, I got a live show with John tonight, or Thursday night, I'm going to be busy with TJ. And then I try to like change or do something other than talk about comic books. Cause I know it can be overwhelming sometimes when you're super excited about a comic book and not everyone else is.
Well, and I do feel like for me, I think the modern definition of nerd has to do with being so interested in one thing that you understand and get into all the layers of it. So I imagine like foodies is a kind of nerd, right? Knowing all about food, understanding all the different ways to prepare things, going to a restaurant and understanding every element on the menu. There's a whole television channels dedicated to just watching food all day long if you really want to. And I think that that anything can be turned into a nerd slice of the pie if you get that into it. And the beauty is, how willing are you to talk about it with just people that you don't know if they're going to be interested in?
Yeah. I think it's easy to, because Marvel and all this other stuff is so big right now, it's definitely easy to kind of break the ice with hey, have you seen Avengers? Or the cool thing about comics is it definitely goes into so many other parts of the nerd spectrum. I am not a statue guy. I have a Green Lantern thing right there. I have a Green Lantern statue. I have like little Pez, people collect Pez things because that's their nerd. Marvel makes cards now.
Yeah, those were cool. I remember when we unboxed, I was on your channel when we unboxed those.
That was a ton of fun. I mean, there's so many avenues that I think comics have kind of like branch themselves out into so many different mediums that it's a very easy way to start the nerd conversation, or to find out how nerdy someone is just by asking if they've seen the most recent Marvel movie.
Well, and TJ sent me a whole set of Serenity comics from the Firefly television show and movie. And for me, it's now like nerd culture and comics are so intertwined that you'll have a Buffy the Vampire Slayer comic, Star Trek comics, Star Wars comics. It's almost like anything that has an element of nerd in it somewhere can be found in comic books as well. Some people are also mentioning there's nerds into craft beers, microbrew. Like I have some crazy brewhead friends that like they're crafting their own beers at home and they're super into it. It's like they nerd out on that. And again, I think some of those nerd pieces of the pie are far more socially acceptable, right? As far as being able to just talk about a group of guys standing in a circle at a party can happily talk about beer and sports, and it's completely acceptable. But the same group of guys talking about Green Lantern sometimes gets a raised eyebrow.
I always like in the nerd community when someone is always like a fan of the opposite, like of the other medium. So for example, with Harry Potter, you have the people that just watch the movies, and then you have the people that are diehard book fans, and hearing them squabble over like which one's better. I love that. That's one of my favorite things ever.
And I think it's so funny that you can have people that are so owning their own nerddom, but at the same time can objectify another group, right? Like the Trekkies versus the Star Wars people, I think has been a classic debate, right? That you can only like one. It's like Beatles and the Stones or something. You can only like one.
Yeah.
And that you have to qualify yourself as this nerd being better than that nerd. When the reality is there should be far more respect across those borders. And I love Star Trek and Star Wars. I would say I'm one of those rare exceptions that I might like them both equally, even though I probably liked Star Wars more as a kid, and I probably like Star Trek. I've come to enjoy Star Trek more now, especially after watching with the girls. We've watched pretty much the entire original series on Netflix. I'm saying it's legit. This is Star Trek: The Next Generation right there. That's one of the seasons.
I've actually been wanting to watch because I can't. I've tried to watch the old Star Trek shows, and it's too
bad.
Old. It's so old. It's so cheesy. But they have that new Star Trek Discovery show, and I feel you're like, maybe that's a good jumping on point. Something.
I think if you've never done it, you should start with The Next Generation and Patrick Stewart, because it is the most accessible one. And
Picard of the USS
Enterprise. And Patrick Stewart is a boss. Like, that guy is badass, and it's the perfect. For me, it's kind of like starting with the 1970s Doctor Who or starting with the 2000s Doctor Who. You could go all the way back to the beginning. If you really want to start at the beginning of Doctor Who, I think that's a foolish mistake, and you're going to have to go through a lot of cruddy, cheap 70s and 80s stuff. It's the same with Star Trek. I think if you started with the Picard stuff, the effects are better, the acting is better, and you'll get more out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I definitely need to I know Fire Guy Ryan and White Whale are the biggest Battlestar Galactica nerds, and I still have not started it, but
we're due a big top 5 on that at some point here soon. Don't worry. You can enjoy us geeking out on that.
So what kind of topics do you think we will have for our future Nerd Alert shows? Because each Nerd Alert show is going to correspond with a different type of category almost, right? Like whether it's books or a show. So what are you thinking for in the future?
This first one obviously was comics, because that's something that we all share. It's not something that is different. We found each other in these online communities because we share an affinity for comic book culture in general. But when Matt and I started bandying around ideas for this show, it was amazing how much overlap we had in interests. Specifically, he and I have a lot of love for books, and fantasy books in particular. We've talked about Lord of the Rings, whether you're talking about the films or our preference probably would be the books. There's a lot of nerd culture built. I mean, you could argue that Lord of the Rings was the original nerd culture. There was this following for it. And I knew growing up that there was people that were obsessed with it, just like the original Trek TV show. Certainly video games have had several years of nerd culture in them, and Dungeons and Dragons. So there are films, there are books, there are television shows, there are games, and they all have an element of nerd culture. I imagine that Matt and I at some point will be definitely going into fantasy novels. We both have this affinity for several stories like Sword of Truth, Game of Thrones, or Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter that we have a lot of passion for. What our hope is that as we do one of these when the Nerd Alert siren goes out and you hear that we are preparing another show, that you can hopefully either figure out a way to join us in the chat or come and be one of our guests to talk about it. That siren is your alarm to let you know to come join us and when we're doing something. I know that Matt, Boy Who Had 7, is a huge Harry Potter fan as well. So whenever we get around to that one, I know we're going to double Matt that one.
Double Matt. All right.
But I know we've also talked Game of Thrones because the final season is coming up, and we have both a big love for the books and the show.
I wouldn't say I have a love for the books. I hate George R. R. Martin.
Okay, you're off the show. We need a whole new.
But that's the best part. Like, is the fact that we do have so many things in common, but everyone's going to have their preference, and I just happen to think he's garbage.
Well, I think that we just definitely discussed early on having differences of opinion on stuff. But Dungeons and Dragons, which you haven't had the chance to enjoy, or Wheel of Time, which I've struggled to get through Wheel of Time.
Oh, it's a hard one. It is a hard one. But luckily, like from Wheel of Time, you can literally just go straight into Brandon Sanderson, who is the heir to the throne, the future greatest fantasy author of all time.
Which one's that?
Brandon Sanderson.
See, I don't think I've read anything by Brandon Sanderson. So.
You will know. He finished Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time after he passed away.
Oh, okay, yeah. I did hear about someone taking over for the Wheel,
Brandon Sanderson.
but I've never read any of his stuff before.
It is magic.
And I see people talking about video games. I grew up. I mean, I had the Commodore 64 with the actual floppy disks that you would have the video games on those. You know, I went through that whole phase, the original and Nintendo and all that kind of thing, up to people now with the PS4s and all the gamers. The great legend, he's always running some kind of video game team up thing. There's a whole layer to geek culture that is video games as well.
Absolutely. And you can go into, I mean, you could break that up into PS4 games, Nintendo. I mean, think about the history of Nintendo. I mean, it's insane. Or you can literally have a whole episode on Halo. Like, you could go into, there's so many things. And I also think that I would love, I mean, the chat has been going crazy.
I'm impressed. We've had like 30 or more people in here the whole time, and we've been going for almost an hour.
One of my favorite things about live shows is when the chat doesn't rely on you and me to be talking. Like, they are having their own conversations without even.
But it's all interconnected, because I see people like Brandon Sanderson's name. I see Commodore 64's. You know, Robert Jordan's name has been coming up a lot, and of course, Lord of the Rings. And
so I think getting the chat, obviously, like the chat's going to have what they like other than what we like. So getting recommendations from the chat. So if you have an idea for a show, for the Nerd Alert show, or if you have a strong feeling and want to be a part of it, leave a comment in down below to let us know what show you want to see and what show you would like to participate in, or you know, something that you can share with the community, because that's what we want. We want people on the show. We want, obviously, John and I will be there to talk about things, stuff that we don't know about, stuff that we do know about, as much involvement as possible.
Yeah, we're probably going to start with stuff that both Matt and I care about, and hopefully find some people that want to join us to talk about those things. But I think Matt's totally right. Part of the fun of this is going to be every once in a while being exposed to something that I don't know very much about, and I can ask my questions and get some responses on things. The same for Matt. And when it comes to, eventually, we're definitely going to do a Dungeons and Dragons, and that's going to be an opportunity for Matt to learn some cool things and ask some questions. Just like if we did Brandon Sanderson tomorrow, I would have a whole lot of questions.
I got issues over here. Don't lie.
Stonecutter Cam threw out one that I had talked to Matt about early on, which was simply like old movies. Because I grew up in a house where old movies were like the language that my dad had to speak in. So black and white movies, Westerns, anything with John Wayne or James Stewart, I grew up watching. And there's an element of nerddom to that as well. I mean, I went through film school with people that had never heard of these people before, and they all wanted to tell me about Martin Scorsese, and I was always talking about John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock. Like, I totally agree that Westerns as a film genre has kind of died away, and it is a nerd to appreciate that is to definitely nerd out. So I think nerddom has several layers. I know that growing in film school, those same people that didn't know about John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock knew all about all those horror films and were super John Carpenter fans, and they could nerd out on their piece of the pie, which was definitely horror movies, and go all day on Wes Craven or whatever.
Yeah, and I think so. If you do post something in the comments of something you want to see, or John, if you have an idea, or if I have an idea, before we do a show of something that maybe we don't know about, I mean, we can pre-plan this forever.
Yeah.
So that way we definitely we're not going in blind, you know, like before we do the show, you should probably read no, there'll be research involved for Matt or I, for sure. And whenever we're exposed to something, again, the first few are definitely going to be stuff that Matt and I care a lot about. But when we start venturing into the shallow waters that we are unfamiliar with, we're going to do some research, and hopefully we're going to rely on the guest who is pushing us in a certain direction to join us. Yes, Stay Puff, the 1982 version of The Thing with Kurt Russell is a masterpiece of filmmaking. I've never seen it. I've heard it's amazing. It's on my list. I promise.
The special effects are really dated. 1982 special effects, but Kurt Russell is a freaking badass, and that movie has such a good ending. Like, it is perfect. It's iconic cinema.
So in my marriage, my ex hated scary movies. So for almost a decade, I haven't watched any of them. I think the new It was the very first scary movie that I had seen in almost 10 years. The Boy Who Had Seven had a great idea. I love it. You should have versus episodes where genres cross over.
Oh,
Can a lightsaber cut through Captain America's shield, or who would win, Dumbledore or Gandalf?
that would be very exciting. My question is, why are they fighting? Because they're both pacifists. Absolutely, they're going to just smoke some Hobbit weed and just relax. That's the reality.
Well, I mean, they both play for the other team.
That's also true. There's a lot of affection that could probably happen.
Maybe they're both, fighting for Grindelwald's love or something.
Right? Well, that could be a love triangle. Yep. The Hobbit in the middle.
Who gets the Grindelwald love? Dumbledore would win that.
So again, you can hit us up on Instagram. We're very easy to find. You can leave a comment at the comment section for this video. If you have a topic that you think we should consider, we've got a pretty long list that we're going to start working through. But these are not regular videos. You're not going to see these once a week. It might just be a thing that when we get an idea we really love and we're ready to roll on, that's when the nerd alert will go out and you guys will know that this is coming and can hopefully either join us in the group here or join us in the chat to discuss it. There's a lot of good ideas going through this chat. I know about sci-fi movies. That seems to be a big hit right now, science fiction film.
One thing I'd like, Daymare's mentioned Ready Player One. And if you, as a fan of all things nerd, if you have not read Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, don't watch the movie.
Yeah, fuck that movie.
Yeah, that movie was awful.
I don't drop a lot of F-bombs on my show, but definitely F that movie.
This book hits you so deep in the nostalgia feels, it'll blow your mind. I mean, the writing is not the best, but it's his first book ever, and it is so full of Easter eggs, literally, and it will just bring you back, and it reads really quick. I mean,
man, you blast through that book for sure.
It's so fast, and like if you like audiobooks, Will Wheaton narrates.
Oh, I love Will Wheaton. Hey, Star Trek.
Oh my God, I listen to the audiobook when, like, anytime I have a road trip and I'm like, I'm really bored, I will put on Ready Player One, no matter where it is in the book, where I'll just press play because it's amazing. So good.
I will say, when we started coming up with the list of things to talk about, obviously Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings were high on that list, but Ready Player One was in the top 3 for both of us as far as something that we could definitely talk about.
Yeah, and it's got a cult following already. I can't speak highly enough about the book series or book. Totally. I guess he's making a second one. We'll see how that goes.
So that's it for us for tonight. I don't have anything huge coming up this week. I've got the book club on Wednesday. I will say in a week and a half, the Comic Core Unlimited, the new Comic Core show, will be running on Wednesdays as well. And I'm going to be one of the members of that group. So stay tuned for that. In a week and a half, we'll have Comic Core Unlimited right before the book club on Wednesdays. So my Wednesdays will be nice and packed. Matt, do you have anything coming up? You have something on Thursday.
That is correct. Thursday, TJ, the Slab Dragon Watson, and Whitewell Comics will both be joining me on my channel. TJ he's going to be doing his first live unboxing with me. And holy crap, one of them is a box that I sent him.
Revenge.
It's the first A-OK I think that he has accepted from anyone. So I am blessed and happy that he accepted it. And he's got some Grail books that he's going to be unboxing. White Whale is just there to look pretty with his beard.
Wonder Woman does that.
Yeah, Wonder Woman's all about that life. So he's going to be there. TJ's going to be there. And I also want to kind of do a Q&A with TJ because he's obviously a super important part of our community. So if you have any questions that are appropriate and would like to know about TJ, shoot me a DM on Instagram. I will also make sure I post on Instagram to just, hey, if you have questions for TJ, send them my way. And if I like the question and I think he'll respond to it, or it's appropriate enough, then I will ask him on our live show on Thursday.
Solid. So that's it for me. Is if there's nothing, do you have any other shows coming up here in the next week?
Nope. That's really it. I'm gonna have to make an update announcement to my 700 subscriber giveaway, but that'll come. I might just go live right after this and do it so I can send books out.
Boom.
But hey, I am so excited. Oh, I do have another show coming up, February 28th. I don't know how I forgot that. The Boy Who Had Seven and I are going to be doing our Green Lantern comic club series, the first one. So if you haven't watched that video, go to my YouTube channel, and it's like the first video there.
I pulled out my trade for Secret Origins. I'm rereading it because it's really good.
It's so good. I completely forgot how exciting this series is going to be, and I am so pumped for it. And John, we're going to have you on that channel.
I told you guys, for me, because I did basically what you're doing with Matt is what Ryan did for me. Like I was like, I know he's super into Green Lantern, so I was like, well, where do I start? And he said the exact same thing you did, which is go with Secret Origin and then start back at the beginning and go through Rebirth, or is it called Rebirth? Yeah, and then it goes through to. I will say I'm one of the outliers who doesn't say Sinestro Corps War or Blackest Night is the best. I will say I haven't read Blackest Night all the way through because I'm waiting for a couple of the other trades that go with it. So it's not, I didn't want to read just the Green Lantern. I wanted to read the Green Lantern Corps and Green Lantern and Blackest Night, all of that stuff together. And I haven't gotten all those trades yet. But I still think No Fear is my favorite of the lot. I like all of them, but No Fear. So I'm excited to hopefully, that's the third trade I think you guys will do. Yeah. So I'm excited to jump in on that one because for some reason that trade really just stuck with me.
I think we're going to make a lot of new Green Lantern fans. I'm going to have more competition for Green Lantern channels here pretty soon.
Good.
But yeah, we'll definitely have you on. So that's coming up February 28th. And it's our first trade that we're reading is Secret Origins. So TJ on Thursday, Secret Origins, February 28th. And that's all I've got. I want to say thank you so much, John. I'm loving this idea. When you we were kind of planning on ideas, and I remember when you said like nerd alert, I'm like, yes, that is perfect. I am so excited. And I think, there's so many directions we can go with this and so many different ideas, and we can get people involved. And I think it's going to be a great time. So thank you so much for the idea. Thank you for considering me as a co-host for this.
I've been trying to figure out a way for us to work on a show together for a while.
Yeah, I'm pumped. So thank you, John.
And thanks to everybody in the chat for coming. There's still 34 people in here. You guys absolutely rock. So thanks so much for hanging with us. Feel free to drop us a line if you've got a nerd alert that you think we should send out. And hopefully we'll see you guys in a couple, 3 weeks here, and we can be geeking out on something else here soon. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night.